Hello and welcome to The Diverse Bookshelf with me, Samia Aziz. On this show, I interview incredible authors doing a deep dive into important themes and issues while talking all things books. Today's episode is about one of my most favourite cities in the world, Sarajevo. Bosnian history is really fascinating, heartbreaking and complex, but gives us so much to learn from, reflect on and truly understand about the world and people in it. In this episode, I'm talking to Priscilla Morris about her debut novel, Black Butterflies, which is set in 1992 in Sarajevo at the beginning of the Siege of Sarajevo, which was initially believed to last just a few days, but continued for 4 years. Born to a Yugoslav mother and English father, Priscilla wrote her debut novel, Black Butterflies, to understand the siege that devastated her mother's hometown of Sarajevo from 1992 to 1996. It has been shortlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction and the Authors Club Best First Novel Award and longlisted for the Wilbur Adventure Writing Prize. It was chosen as an Indie Fiction Book of Month in May 2022. It's currently being translated into Bosnian, Italian and Catalan. Priscilla lectures in creative writing at University College Dublin and has taught at the University of East Anglia, Kingston University and City Lit. She has an MA with distinction and a PhD in creative writing from UEA. She read Italian, Spanish and social anthropology at Cambridge University. I'm so glad she's my guest today. Hi Priscilla, thank you so much for joining me on the Diverse Bookshelf today. How are you doing?
A pleasure to be here. I'm doing very well, thank you.
So you've written absolutely stunning book called Black Butterflies, which at the time that we're recording this has been shortlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction. Massive congratulations. I'm really excited to see what the panel decide in terms of who the winner is, but I feel like that's such a huge achievement anyway, so congratulations.
Thank you so much.
To begin with, I'd really like it if you could just talk us through your novel a little bit, just tell us what it's about.
Yeah, sure. So my novel is set in Sarajevo, Bosnia, in the former Yugoslavia in the early 1990s. And it follows the story of Zora Kocevic, who's an artist and teacher, 55-year-old artist and teacher. And it's basically experience of the first 10 months of the siege of Sarajevo. It really follows her experience very closely, how her normal life is completely turned upside down. No one was really aware that such a long, almost 4-year war was about to break out. And it's this process of violence happening, of electricity, water, food supplies being cut one by one, and this constant struggle to understand what's going on, this normalization of what's going on, and how her neighbours, she lives in a tower block on the 8th floor of a 16-storey tower block, how all her neighbours, who are all of diverse ethno-nationalities, pull together and help each other. And it's a story of art and war in a nutshell.
And hope, I think. and resilience. I think it's a story of a lot of...
It's a story of hope, resilience and strength, and art overcoming the tragedy of war.
Yeah. So what led you to write this particular story? Like, what things inspired it? I mean, I do know that some of your own family history and experiences have fed into the novel. But yeah, if you could just share what were your inspirations behind it.
Yeah. So my mother is from Sarajevo. My father's English. My mother left when she was 19, long before the war broke out. But her parents and all of her relatives were trapped in Sarajevo when the war started. So I was 19 at the time. And that sort of following year, we had a steady influx of refugees from Bosnia and Serbia passing through our London home. My father went out and rescued my grandparents from the siege after about 10 months. And so it was this very traumatic time. It was awful watching the news each night and seeing these images of people being shot on the street by snipers, of constant shelling, and also because all the phone lines had been cut, we had no way of contacting my grandparents to know if they were alive. Months went past with no contact. Also, there was no postal service, just absolutely no. This was in the days just before emails. There was absolutely no way of contacting them, and it was awful, as you can imagine. And so eventually my father just decided to take it into his own hands, and he got a ticket out to Split in Croatia and then made his own way, sort of hitchhiking with journalists and stuff, and got into Sarajevo, where he spent 3 weeks trying to procure papers to get my grandparents out, because it was kind of relatively easy, let's say, people from outside to get into the siege if they had something like a journalist pass or were from an NGO, but impossible for near impossible, the citizens of Sarajevo to leave. So he did manage to get them out in the end. And it was his diary of this time. And then also what particularly inspired Black Butterflies was the story of my great uncle, who was an artist, a kind of well-known, well-respected landscape painter in Sarajevo, who had his studio above the National Library in the Old Town Hall. And there was this fire that happened in August of 1992 when the Old Town Hall was shelled, and my great uncle lost all his life's work. His studio burnt down. He did manage to escape to England, and he started painting again at a very old age, despite having lost everything. And it was very much his story when I first heard it, which was at my grandfather's funeral, that was such a story of hope. And it was such a story of, this is, an old man who's lost his city, his friends, his entire life's work has burnt down, and yet he has somehow found the strength to carry on painting. And he settled in Bristol in the end, and he painted for the last 2 decades of his life. That was very, very inspiring to me. My grandfather, unfortunately, wasn't, he didn't really get over it. He was rescued, as I said, by my father, but he died a few years later. I mean, it's, just imagine being torn from the city, your home city, at such an old age. And so I was just very inspired by my great uncle's story of art and how it helped him to integrate and heal some of the tragedy of war. And this is where the inspiration from Black Butterflies came from. It was a desire both to write about art and war, and also a desire for me to really try to understand in my own way and process this war many years later.
I love the exploration of art and war, because it isn't something that we see that much of. I mean, I kind of feel like there's probably like the odd documentary that's been done, after a certain event took place like decades later. But it's such an interesting thing to think about when we think about war, because we think about maybe like the human cost or the environmental cost or the damage of property and buildings, and like in terms of Sarajevo, the entire city was destroyed essentially. But for an artist to have all of their work destroyed, and we see that in the book as well, and what really comes through the pages is Zora's pain. Like, she is like brutally wounded by the loss of her paintings, and she's alive and she knows her family's all safe, but there feels like a part of her has just been taken away. And I think that does extend to other art forms in some ways. Like, I think war can affect your ability to be creative if you're a writer. It can affect your ability to dance if you're a dancer or if you're an actor. But I think painting is also so different, because it's like physically something is destroyed, but we don't tend to explore that very often. So I really loved that exploration in your book, especially because I think we're trying to think a bit more deeply and with a bit more nuance about war and understanding that it's more than just statistics and it's not heroic and it's really, really awful. So I feel like this book gives us just a completely different lens to look at some of the damage that can be caused. And thank you so much for sharing your own, like your great uncle story. It sounds incredibly inspiring. So I think one of the things that really fascinate me about the siege in Sarajevo and the war is the fact that we had such a diverse community where everybody was living so closely together and on such good terms. And I mean, you write about it in the book that like basically all families are now mixed because everyone's gotten married, and yet this siege starts. Now, for the benefit of anyone listening that may not know what Sarajevo was like at the time, could you just give us like a really short description of what the situation was like at the time before the siege started?
Yeah, so basically Sarajevo was, and Bosnia in fact, were well known throughout Yugoslavia for being the least nationalistic of the 6 former Yugoslav republics. So Bosnia, in 1991, it was the last time they did a census there. And if I can remember correctly, I think it was something like 43% Muslim, 31% Serb, and 17% Croat, give or take a percentage point. So that was kind of the split of the main 3 ethno-nationalities that they had there. I'm calling them ethno-nationalities because it's a bit confusing to many people. You've got, the term Muslim, which obviously is we associate with Islam and is a religion, and then you've got Serb, which basically means originally had a Serbian Orthodox background, and Croat would be coming from a Catholic background. During Tito's rule, when Yugoslavia was communist, both nationality was really downplayed. So it's very, nationalism was very, very stamped out and frowned upon. But also religion was downplayed too. And my mother growing up in Sarajevo, and many people that I've talked to there, would say, okay, they really didn't know the ethnicity of the peers and their neighbours that they were growing up with. And it was famous for everyone getting on together and living side by side in relative ease and companionship. And so what happened with the war is that a lot of hatred was stirred up and a lot of nationalism sort of erupted in the wake of communism. And basically these sort of not new, but like the old identities were awoken. And so I know that basically many Muslims never went to mosque before, and similarly many Serbs and Croats didn't go to church and cathedral, and suddenly everyone again started going back to their religious traditions, which maybe their families hadn't been practicing for the last 2 or 3 generations, let's say. And it was really, really sad. My own family, okay, so the statistics were that 1 in 3 families in Sarajevo were mixed. My own family was mixed. So my grandfather was Bosnian Serb, my grandmother was Slovenian Catholic, married with a lot of Muslims and no Croats, but that was just, it was a mixture of all 3 religions, so Muslim, Orthodox and Catholic there. And this was completely normal. And this is what I knew going to Sarajevo as a child and what I loved about it. And I speaking earlier, you said you'd visited Bosnia a couple of times, and what a beautiful mixture of all the different East and Western religions there are there. And so I absolutely loved this. And so for me, it was incredibly sad to see the nationalism rising there and to see people suddenly defining themselves as Serb, Croat, Muslim, rather than Yugoslav. And the rising intolerance and nationalism that occurred was desperately sad.
So I read some work by Hasan Nuhanovic, who most of his life in Bosnia, and he writes about the siege, and he later on he writes about what happened at Srebrenica. And one of the things that really stood out for me was he talks really early on in his writing about the word or the phrase Bosnian Muslim.
Yep.
And he says that there's a difference between Muslim with a capital M and with a small m. And he says, the capital M is someone of the Islamic faith.
Right.
But when we talk about Muslims or Bosnian Muslims, we use the small m because what we're actually referring to is an ethnic identity. And I found it so interesting. And yeah, like whenever I've gone to Bosnia, I feel like people, even like Muslims, everyone expresses their faith in so many different ways. And there are a lot of mosques, but there are a lot of churches and other things as well. But I remember finding that very, like, really interesting. And you just said the same, like you refer to them as ethno identities rather than purely religious, because it seemed to like transcend those boundaries.
Yep. Yes. And yeah, that's very interesting about Muslims with a small m, because, just a lot of the distinguishing marks wouldn't be present there. For example, drinking alcohol and eating pork and stuff. And it's just, it's also, there's just to delve momentarily back into the history, it's because Bosnia was part of the Ottoman Empire for 5 centuries that there are many Muslims in Bosnia, but it's not at all. Everyone are Slavs, so they all come from the same race of people. So there's no way of telling racially, for example, who is a Muslim and who is a Serb. And in fact, I really wanted to make this clear in my book, where I give Mirsad and Samir blue eyes, for example, and Una, who is a little girl who's part Croatian, part Serb. She's got very dark colouring with dark eyes and dark hair. And this absolutely, I just wanted to make that clear, because I think sometimes people who haven't been to Bosnia really misunderstand the situation, and that it's not a matter of race. It is a matter of faith and cultural tradition.
Yeah, it's just really complex layers of identity, I guess, as well. And so, yeah, I think the thing that obviously, like I said this before as well, that really fascinates me is when you have a place that is so diverse, but also, so kind of like, what's the right word to use, when everyone is coexisting very hard, in harmony, like everyone's living together and getting on. They don't feel a division, they don't feel nationalistic or that a certain identity is better than another. And then when you have war break out, and obviously it doesn't happen overnight. And I don't think it's ever happened anywhere around the world overnight. I think we always see historically changes come in slowly. But again, through my reading and even in your book as well, I think there's this big sense of feeling that this siege isn't going to last. It's just going to it'll be over in a few days or a few weeks at most, because it's unthinkable that a place like Bosnia and a place like Sarajevo could be at war for that long. And I just wondered if you could elaborate a little bit on that, because I mean, I think it's happened historically around the world as well. Like when I think about the partition of India and Pakistan, that in some ways was very similar. You had Muslims and Hindus and Sikhs living side by side, and they were like eating together and like friends, and they consider themselves brothers and sisters. But at time of partition, when it became brutal and people were having to make a decision and having to take a side, people turned against each other so violently. It's just so strange to think about how close they were before that. And I think the experience is similar in some ways in Bosnia. Yeah, so I just wondered if you could talk a bit about that.
Yes. Yeah, it is similar. I guess, yeah, so certainly I've spoken to many people who said, they were literally this experience of suddenly turning around and finding your neighbor or your old classmate is on the opposite side to you. And so in Sarajevo, you basically had the Bosnian Serb nationalists surrounded the city from positions in the hills and shelled the city for 3.5 years. And the city was sort of divided. Certain parts became Serb and other parts were government defended. So what it meant, government defended, the government was led by Izzet Begovic, but who was Muslim. But he had defending Sarajevo a mixed army. So it was a mixed territorial defense force. So it was predominantly Muslim, but also there were Serbs and Croats fighting in that army to defend Sarajevo from the Bosnian Serb nationalists that were attacking it. So I think this kind of leads to a very complicated picture. It wasn't as easy as sort of Serbs attacking Muslim. That wasn't what was happening. And also the defending government very much were putting, what they wanted was a united Bosnia of all three ethno-nationalities. So it wasn't as, in some ways it was more complicated than other comparable scenarios where it's one side against another, because here you've kind of got one side against three sides altogether. And so it was it makes it a very tricky war to understand. And in Black Butterflies, Zora's position is she's an anti-nationalist. And so she refuses to take sides. She doesn't want to align with any of the three nationalist sides. And that was increasingly a very, very difficult position to hold. It was one that perhaps a lot of educated people and artists and the young people held who lived in the cities in particular. So in Black Butterflies, there's this description of one of the peace protests that happened just before war breaks out. And so there was this sort of young voice that very much, well, obviously anti-war, but also anti-nationalism. And they wanted to live side by side with everyone. But unfortunately, this voice, this anti-nationalist voice, got stamped out quite early. And Zora sort of continues to represent that voice. And it was connected with artists, musicians, people from Sarajevo. It was quite often, there was a bit of a rural city divide in this war, where poorer people from the sort of surrounding rural areas did tend to become more nationalist, actually. I sort of heard that quite a lot in Sarajevo, whereas the sort of more educated, cosmopolitan people who lived in Sarajevo would have tended to be more anti-nationalist.
Yeah, I mean, that doesn't surprise me, that last bit that you said, because when I think about such harsh right-wing ideology when it comes to nationalism and war, and I think about some of the far-right groups like in the UK, my immediate perception of them is that they're not creative or very educated, which I don't know if that's like maybe just too much prejudice on my part, but I believe that, because I guess when you are forcing yourself to think about things a little bit more deeper, you understand how complex things are. Maybe there's a bit more empathy, a bit more humility and understanding and respect that develops too. So that was interesting.
That's certainly how I would see things. Of course, not everyone would see things that way. But yeah, that was my understanding, and it's what people who I spent 5 months in total in Sarajevo in 2010 researching the novel and speaking to people who'd lived through the siege to really understand what life was like under siege. And that's what people were telling me about the situation. I mean, I did also speak to people who had all sorts of different views, and it's very sad now because it's it is a divided country, and there's deep scars, of course, left by the war. And so, if you just dig a little bit under the surface, people are still very, very traumatized by it. And it has led to a complete hardening of these national divides, which is just, it's very upsetting.
Yeah.
And, so me writing this novel is at the moment, I was trying to capture this moment of Zora being this anti-nationalist creative voice and this circle of friends that she made. Mirsad, who is her neighbour and who becomes a very, very close friend of hers, is a bookstore owner and also writer and storyteller. So there is this theory of not just visual art, but also art through stories and literature running through it. And, I was concerned with capturing that while it was being very threatened, and as a way of expressing what I see as the real spirit of Sarajevo, which for me is this resilience, this what they call the common life there, living side by side with people from different faiths.
So I love the character of Zora, and I also I think I also really admire her as a character because she's so strong, but also like with her age in terms of like where she is in life. Like she's married, she's got her daughter has grown up and living in England, but she's living her best life before the siege anyway. She's living her best life, painting and teaching art as well, and she's got students and she's living in this nice place with her husband, and her mother's not too far away. And I love that for her. At the beginning of the book, I'm like, wow, she's great, I want to be like that. Like you just kind of having a great life. How did you come to form the character of Zora? Where did she come from?
So she was, as I was saying, she was partly inspired by my great uncle, or directly inspired by him, who was a painter. But he was older. He was 68 when the siege started, and so Zora is younger. And I also think she was very much informed by both my great uncle's wife, my great aunt, who spoke to me at length about her experience of the siege, and other women that I met in Sarajevo. So I interviewed a lot of women about their experience of the siege. And for some reason, maybe because I'm a woman, maybe because it's what I was more interested in, it was their stories of the minutiae of day-to-day life under siege that really got into my head and stuck with me. And so I really started seeing the war very much through the prism of a woman's eyes. And then, I don't know, there's just a little bit of magic with the creation of a character. She really came fully formed to me one day, because I actually started writing this novel quite a long time ago, but with a male protagonist. And it just didn't really lift off. It was too close to my great uncle's story. And I just felt like I couldn't move. It was becoming like a memoir, which I didn't want to write. And I couldn't move from all the details he'd told me. He'd told me that his suitcase was brown and then it had to be brown in the book, things like that. Whereas when Zora came to me, she was younger. She very clearly was a redhead, and my hair, dyed red, orange hair in my mind. She was a very bold character. She had to be quite a strong woman, because it was still quite unusual at that time for women to make it as artists and be successful as painters in quite a patriarchal society. So she came to me and I was like, yes. And immediately the novel became mine, and it became much more of, she has a real energy and resilience that I love, and so it was a pleasure writing it with her as the lead character.
That's so great. I'm not surprised that it was a woman that kind of like brought your story to life, and that it was speaking to women that, I guess, like, move things forward for you. I think when we think about, or like typically and historically, when we think about war, we think of it as like, a battle between men that go off and fight. But what I've become increasingly interested in is women. It's like, what happens to those that are women, that are at home, that are looking after their families, that are trying to survive. Because although there may be a battle happening, and it may be that you're living in the epicenter of it, but you may not be, but still your life is massively impacted. And actually, like, some of the things that I have read and come across with regards to the siege in Sarajevo and the war is that women faced awful atrocities, and children too, and this is, we're not going to share gory stories here, but it was very difficult for women. But I think what I love about the book is that, like, you take us through day-to-day life, and although, like, we see the kind of destruction that happens, it's less about that per se, less about the actual attacks happening. Like, we don't have like a timeline of the actual siege. We don't know what happened on what day, but we do know is how Zora and her community or friends got through it every single day. And it's important, I think, to understand that when we think about war as well, because it's not just about the people that are fighting or being made to fight. It's about every single person that's impacted by it. And you're impacted in terms of the food that you have access to, and your electricity, as you detail in the book, and water supply, things that you might not even think about, and art as well, in the way that you explore it as well. So I thought that was so great.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you. I think I mean, you said a lot there. One of the interesting things about writing this is when I first realized I was wanting to write it, it was from a place, of course, of family history and of me wanting to understand the war in the former Yugoslavia. But I wasn't necessarily someone who, I mean, I'd always wanted to be a writer. I always devour fiction, but war books were not necessarily something I would have necessarily gravitated towards. So it was quite interesting to me to then find myself writing a war book. And, for me, I do kind of associate it with a kind of quite a male genre and battle scenes and everything. And it's not necessarily that interesting for me. So I wanted to write something from a female perspective. And also the thing about the Siege of Sarajevo is that it's not a traditional war in the sense of a battlefield and of men going to fight. This was about civilians being shot at. It was a siege so it's, this was about everyday people being shot at, men, women and children, all ages, indiscriminately. And so I really wanted to capture that, and I was very interested in what it means to live under siege, what it means to have everything that you rely on cut off one by one: electricity, heating, water, food supplies, and how we survive in those conditions. You also talked about the atrocities committed against women during this war, and it was horrific. There were many, there were rape camps that were opened up in Bosnia. It was sort of sexual violence was part of the campaign of ethnic cleansing, and that, although I don't directly touch upon that in my novel, I was obviously very aware of it. And Slavenka Drakulic has written an amazing, very harrowing novel about the experience of Bosnian rape camps called As If I'm Not There. There's this interesting thing, I think, to do with Bosnia, in that there really is a very strong still, I mean, it may be dying out now, I'm not sure, but sense of patriarchy there. When I asked my relatives in Sarajevo for a family tree, I was given something that didn't have any women in it. And I was like, what's this?
Oh, wow.
It's like, the women apparently don't count. It was just the male line. So that was quite shocking to me. And yet, despite this, some of the strongest women I know come from Sarajevo, including my mother. And so there is a real strength as well. And, certainly the women I talked to were resilient, strong, hardworking, very impressive women. And so I wanted to capture some of this in Zora.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned earlier that from speaking to people, you see how still kind of like fragmented and sort of hurt and broken communities in Bosnia are. I think that's probably because it's such recent history, like the early 90s is barely 30 years ago, right? So that's very, very recent. If we look historically, like almost nothing happens in 3 decades, right? Like it's a really small piece, a really short span of time. But the thing that gets to me about it is that it's such recent history, and yet we don't know nearly enough about it, generally speaking. So I mean, in the early 90s, I was a baby. I was like 2 in 1992, so I don't have any memories of the time. But I find it bizarre that when I was growing up, so like when I was 10, I don't know what happened 8 years ago, or like a few years ago, because the siege lasted for 4 years. It would have only been 4 years later when I was 10. I don't remember seeing anything on the news. I don't remember learning anything in school. My knowledge of Bosnia has come literally, I think, within the last kind of 10 years of my life. And that's because I've been really interested and I've come across different stuff, and, things a bit more now. There's like events and things that happen to commemorate things. And it shocks me as well that even like my parents, for example, will say things like, oh yeah, we did see, like, we know that things happened, but it still doesn't seem to be widely recognized or understood. Why do you think that is?
That is a very good question, which I will actually need to reflect on more, because, genuinely, I need to really think about that, because for me, obviously, given that it's my family, it's like very loud and present in my life. And I've spent the last 13 years dedicated to studying and writing about it. And so what's happened is that, rather like being in an echo chamber, I've been reading and talking to people who know lots about it. So it has been interesting for me stepping out of that and realizing that not everyone does, of course, especially people who were born just after it. I mean, certainly I was 19 at the time when war broke out, and certainly for those 4 years, it really did dominate the news, second or third or first news item every night. And yet, even with all that, there was this strange lack of understanding of what was actually going on. So it was just this violence. But, if you think about it, it's a country that is nearer than Ukraine. It is in Europe. It is extraordinary. And it may be that there are other countries that, there's a huge Bosnian diaspora now. About half the country were displaced either internally or externally. But it may be that the UK didn't take so many Bosnian and former Yugoslav refugees. Other European countries took more, closer countries. So they may have more awareness. There may be all sorts of reasons depending on how the world is arranged geopolitically, that it has sort of sunk from memory a bit. But it is a really good question. Yugoslavia certainly used to have quite an important role in the world, because it was one of the few non-aligned important countries that played this kind of almost diplomatic negotiating role between East and West when the Iron Curtain was in place. But when, with the falling of the Berlin Wall in 1989, and when Tito died before that in 1980, it started to lose its sort of strategic international significance. Yep, and basically disintegrated into these wars that took up the early 1990s.
Because so obviously, like when I was at school and we learn about the First World War, and I've just had this fact in my head that the First World War was triggered by the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo. That is a fact that has been like ingrained in my mind since I read it the first time in my history textbook at school. I don't actually know. I can't tell you anything about Archduke Franz Ferdinand, right? And I remember the first time I went to Sarajevo, my colleague, he pointed out the place to me near the bridge, and he was like, "That's a really significant point in history. Do you know why?" And I was like, "No, I don't know. I think about Bosnian history." And he said, "Oh, think about the First World War." And it was just like the penny just dropped. And I was like, wow, this is a really significant place. But it's so strange how, like you said, it's kind of, it's kind of like disappeared into the background a little bit.
It's an extraordinarily significant place on the world stage, really, and one that for quite a small city really punches above its weight. And as you said, it was the assassination of Franz Ferdinand was the event that triggered World War I, and it was kind of the end of the Habsburg Empire, the end of the time of empires. So, Sarajevo is known for this act of violence that triggered World War I, and then it went out. The 20th century exited the 20th century with violence again. I mean, it's a fascinating history. So Yugoslavia sort of existed in between those 2 points for 73 years. This was a country that had basically a human lifespan of only 73 years. And that, for me, I still get a little bit of a shock when I read in Wikipedia that Yugoslavia was a country that existed for most of the 20th century, because when I was born, that was my mother's country, and it was larger than life. And I didn't realize that countries could be born and die like that. And it really did have a very strong character and presence. Yeah, a fascinating city, very beautiful, very unique city. Geographically, it's beautiful, surrounded by mountains. It's got, all the different areas and the mosques, the cathedrals, the synagogue, the churches, little cobbled streets. I mean, it's a beautiful, beautiful city to visit. And there's something about it that's hugely symbolic. There's something to do with its uniqueness and the fact that these events of really worldwide significance have played out on its stage that give everything about it imbue it with some sort of symbolism that make it people get very drawn to it. I'm sure, so you've been there. Once you've been there, you can kind of understand its beauty and uniqueness, and why, people have said to me, why didn't Zora leave? Why didn't she leave immediately? But people really did stay, even when they realized war was breaking out, because they felt a real passion for their hometown. There was no other place like it for them in the world. And you can kind of understand that when you go there.
Yeah. And I think generally as well, I feel like we've become a bit desensitized in terms of how we view the refugee experience, and just kind of if they're in danger, they need to leave. But what we're seeing a bit more of, I think, in literature think in film as well is this exploration of exactly how difficult that decision is to leave your home, your family, your community. I read a book recently about the Syrian crisis, and someone describes just the connection to the earth, and like it's so profound and so beautiful. And yeah, like and you in Black Butterflies really bring that out as well. Like Zora is she doesn't want to leave. I mean, at one point she feels like maybe she should, but then it's too late anyway. But it's her home, it's her city, and she's what really comes out through the pages is the pain when she sees different landmarks and places destroyed. And that, like, really, I think as a reader, like, that's very, very powerful. Like, you bring that out so beautifully in the book. But yeah, I wondered if you could reflect a little bit on that, like how our concepts of like home and safety and identity are so badly impacted by things like war.
Yes. I mean, well, on a sort of kind of obvious physical level, you've got the destruction of the physical environment around you. And so you have your home being shelled, for example, or the electricity being cut, going without heating. Your home, the place that is providing you with your basic needs of shelter, warmth, protection, is no longer doing that. And so that, for anyone, is very threatening and precarious. But then you've got all the sort of symbolic layers and the identity layers and the layers of memory that are imbued within your home space. And if you are seeing the people around you, neighbours, friends, etc., suddenly against you, if you are suddenly being challenged or you're not welcome in certain places when you go to buy bread because of your ethno-nationality, so it's not only the physical environment, but it's the way that people are relating to you in a place that you've grown up your entire life and lived your whole life is now changing. Everything becomes very slippery and surreal. So that's another impact of war. And then your life is in danger, of course. In the case of Sarajevo, it was literally you were taking your life into your own hands to go and fill up a canister of water down in the street because a sniper might shoot you. And suddenly you're being forced into living your life in survival mode, and you're never knowing if you will actually get through the day. The days lost their meaning. There was no working week anymore and weekends. It was just day-to-day survival, and you never knew when it was going to end and if you would see your neighbours and friends again. So all of this, and there's this book that I'd really recommend for people, if a non-fiction book, if they're interested in really understanding the experience of life under siege, which is an ethnography by a Croatian writer called Ivana Macek. That's Macek. And it's called Sarajevo Under Siege. Beautiful ethnography, talking about what it was like to live in Sarajevo. There's a whole chapter on death and creativity and how people really did respond, especially in the second year of the siege, with real creativity, a bit like Zora does. Performances were put on in shelled theatres and art exhibitions were held. And this really did happen. People really struggled on through. But what was very interesting there is that she talks about this process of shock and normalization. So you have something taken from your home that really shakes you, and your sense of place and self. But then we just tend as a species to normalize things. It's the only way we can go on. So you're like, okay, the water's gone. I'm now going to try and normalize this and get on with my life. Okay, I'm no longer safe. It's no longer safe to walk that way to the baker's. So I have to walk this very, very long route round. Otherwise I might be shot. And you just normalize this. And so I wanted also to get that across in the novel, this sort of oscillation between shock and normalizing until you're really living in a very extreme situation, which we reading it are like, my God, what is it? But somehow the characters have adapted and normalized to this experience.
It's a survival, isn't it? Different ways. Well, maybe the only way you can survive is just to understand that this is your reality and you find ways to get through it. But yeah, thank you for sharing that.
Yes.
That book sounds really interesting as well. What do you really hope that those that pick up your book will take away from it?
Well, I hope people who are a bit younger and don't remember or didn't live through the war will develop some awareness of it. And I just think it's important to understand that this war happened in Europe not so very long ago and went on for 4 years, and to get more of an understanding into it. For those who did live through it, it will remind them, and that's what people say to me reading it, and they're taken back to that time and again deepening their understanding a bit. I'd just like people to really take on board that how quickly a multicultural society can actually fall apart and how precarious things are, and that did see how quickly things can change, and just to, I mean, I'm sure I'm preaching to the converted here, of course, but just to honour the anti-nationalist voice. And
so Black Butterflies is your debut novel. Is there anything else you're working on? Can we expect anything more from you?
Yes.
Soon?
Yeah, absolutely, definitely. So I'm working on my second novel at the moment, which is not a work of historical fiction and doesn't deal with war, but I suppose the similarity will be that it's very much concerned with a woman who is at the kind of midpoint of her life. She's 49 in this case, and she's going through a late blooming. She's kind of a bit voiceless and invisible, and she goes through a late turning point at this cusp in her life. I think that's all I'll say.
Well, you know, that sounds great. From the little that you've already said, it sounds great. I mean, I am not 49, but I'm really trying to take on a more positive and a welcoming approach to aging, and that's partly why I loved Zora. I was like, you know, she's having a great time. She's done with raising her kids, like she's having a great time. So I look forward to generally, I think, just seeing more empowered and empowering characters that are not 21. I think it will be good. It will be great. But thank you so much for your time today. I have loved speaking to you, and I really hope that more people pick up Black Butterflies.
Thank you so much, Samira. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Priscilla for such an interesting and warm conversation. I loved every moment of it and I hope that you did too. If you enjoyed the podcast, please follow the Diverse Bookshelf on your podcast platform of choice and connect with me on social media. I'd love to hear from you. I would really appreciate it if you could rate and leave a review, as it helps more people find the podcast.